Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets.
I hit pre-record.
Okay, so let's just
kill the flow.
No, that's because it's always better the second time that you do it.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the 60th time that you do it, but second or third time. So this time around, we're going to be talking about James Shelby Downard. So the first question is, who's James Shelby Downard, and why should we spend any time talking about him? Downard is probably most simply described as a 20th century American conspiracy theorist. There are a lot of those. He's certainly by no means the only one. There are some people who've argued that Downard effectively began the whole sort of modern cycle of American conspiracy theory, which is saying way too much, but he did contribute to it. And he's certainly not a household name. And the way that most people would have any kind of contact with him, if you're out on the internet, if you go and you start Googling James Shelby Downard, what you'll almost certainly first come across is a work which he wrote, or which is attributed to him, those aren't necessarily the same thing, called King Kill 33. Now, that was written sometime back in the 1970s. This is when he did most of his writing, 70s, maybe early 80s. He died in the late 90s. He was around for some time after that. But his active period was, I'd say basically 70s and early 80s. King Kill 33 is Downard's take on the JFK assassination. And the interesting thing about his take, what differentiates it from most of the others, is that, was there a conspiracy behind the assassination? Oh, yeah, there's one of those. But Downard then brings in the idea of the assassination as essentially an occult ritual, that it was a ritual sacrifice.
Oh. So I've heard this. This has become quite it's developed its own set of conspiracies.
Yeah. Okay, that idea has gone much further and wider, but I think that, fairly enough, begins with him. And what he connects it to is the thing that runs through most of his work, what he calls Masonic sorcery. So are you wondering, does Downard have a thing about Freemasons? Yes, he does. He also has a thing about the KKK. Yes, he has a thing about the military-industrial complex. In fact, Downard's whole view of the world that you get through his writings is completely and thoroughly paranoid. And it's relatively easy. In fact, you can document this, he spent 2 periods of his life in mental institutions. And the simplest way that you can dismiss Downard is by going, the guy's a paranoid schizophrenic, or at least he's paranoid. I don't know about the schizophrenic part, but he's paranoid. He's nuts, and therefore you shouldn't pay any attention to what he says. And that's a piece of advice that will come up fairly often. Look, obviously this person is crazy, so why are you listening to crazy people? I think generally that can be good advice, but there are a couple of caveats to that. One is defining exactly what crazy is. Now, and paranoia is one of those things. Sometimes people are paranoid, just because they're crazy. They're just imagining things. In other cases, people are paranoid because lots of really bad things have happened to them, and they have become increasingly suspicious, which then begins to manifest itself as paranoia. There is a certain point, what appears to be paranoia can be that. It can be a delusion, based upon something that isn't real. In other cases, the same sort of behavior can actually manifest a reality. This person actually is under threat or is threatened by someone. They have every reason to feel that way. In Downard's case, I'd sort of say that it's probably a combination of both of those.
Does this stem back from his childhood, or? Well,
according to him, yeah. Because where do we begin with James Shelby Downard? Well, let's say so King Kill 33, Rise Later, is his, I think, appropriately paranoid view that the Kennedy assassination, the Jack Kennedy assassination, not the other one, was a Masonic ritual sacrifice. That is, it was carried out where it was, and at the time it was, and in a particular manner in order to achieve an end or to make a particular influence in this case. That again is kind of the basic definition of a ritual. It's a series of things, generally events or actions, a series of actions that occur in a precise manner to produce an effect on the observers.
And what, in his estimation, what was the desired effect?
To usher in some type of new reality. I mean, one, to get rid of the president that apparently they didn't want. But that's the sort of point in his theory, if there is a point in his theory, is that it wasn't simply an assassination to get rid of an unwanted leader and replace them with another, because usually that's what assassinations are. You're just having someone murdered so that you can put someone else in their place. You don't like them. No, the idea of King Kill 33 is that all of this was carefully orchestrated to time and place and manner in order to usher in some sort of new, not just political leadership, but some kind of new political reality.
So I've heard this in reference to, kind of this greater, all the elite class, either call it Illuminati or they Abramovich, the spirit cooking. I've seen this theory kind of put together with other things, saying that the elite class above you, the elite political or financial class, they did, essentially what Downard puts forward to kind of usher in their rule. Is that generally the idea, or is that just a mutation?
Well, I think two ways you can look at it. One is that arguably they do it for their own amusement.
Yeah.
That it's the term that's sometimes connected with this, which Downard may have come up with, I'm not sure, is revelation of the method. Revelation of the method is something which arguably occultists of one form or another, they're rituals carried out in public.
Okay.
But the public, which witnesses them, is only vaguely aware of what happens. In other words, for most people who witnessed the JFK assassination, I mean, very few people who witnessed this, the people who heard about it, saw it on TV. This is, it's just one of those terrible things that happened, which is in some way unexplainable to them. To the people, in Downard's view, to the people who orchestrated this, however, this is a necessary action in order to advance history or the future in the direction you want it to go.
Well, so obviously very recently, the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, I've heard it explained in very much the same way. It's, aside from kind of the realpolitik of you want to see kind of a public execution of a leader who's gained essentially cult status for his best followers, or most ardent followers. There's the other aspect that kind of delegitimizes the old system and or reinforces maybe the power of the people who are currently calling the shots. At least that's the argument that I've heard. That seems, or the Olympics, I guess, the ceremony, they're putting it in your face. There's some kind of occult ritual happening.
Well, if you want to see that, go back a few years and look at the videos of the St. Gotthard tunnel opening.
Okay.
That you can still find those, I'm sure, and anybody who would interested. The St. Gotthard, I think it's Gotthard, The opening of the tunnel, maybe 10 years ago, there was a whole very elaborate ceremony.
This is France.
And if you can explain to me what the hell's going on there, I'm always interested in that. But it is, why would you do that to open a tunnel is beyond me.
This is France, correct?
Yes. Okay. Between France and Italy.
They seem like they have a very interesting history because the most recent Olympic opening ceremony, and then whenever it was there the last time in the early 2000s, both of them get pulled out as like these very odd kind of occult rituals, but I think it's just trying
similar
to
Super Bowl ads.
Yeah.
Well, the reasoning behind that, if there is a reasoning, is that this provides a gigantic audience.
Yeah.
So again, this concept of revelation of the method is that what the people behind this do, what those orchestrating the ritual want to do, is that in some way they get off on showing off in front of the profane, the uninitiated, the masses of people who will not realize what's happening, even though it's happening directly in front of them. And one of the terms that Downard uses for that is the hoodwink, the deceit, the deception. The idea here is that it's, the deception is even in some way more delicious if you can carry on this action in front of the very people you're deceiving. You can watch them be deceived by your actions or confused by it. So that's one idea. That Downard's view of what he calls Masonic sorcery or this type of political sorcery is just there really for the delectation of those people doing it. They get off on this in some way. They enjoy watching their own. They're like a Bond villain who really gets, apparently sexually aroused by their own villainy.
Monologue.
This is why they have to go into long explanations of what we're going to do. But the other view is that, no, there's a more practical purpose to this, and the practical purpose to those rituals is the same for all magical applications, Aleister Crowley would argue, which is to shape reality. Mm. Now, that goes on the assumption that you can do that rituals, sacrifices, lots of holding hands and wishing really, really hard can make things happen the way that you want. I don't know. I can't say that's ever particularly worked for me, but on the other hand, it doesn't mean that it doesn't. It doesn't mean that other people don't believe that it works for them.
You've never manifested $1 million?
I've never been able to manifest. I'm not sure I've really manifested much of it, but these things are out of your control. But that's really the sort of goal of this is to shape the perceived goal. So here again, the idea isn't that you or I or that anybody listening actually has to believe that that's possible. But what you do need to realize is that there are people who do believe that that is possible. They can be completely deluded. Nothing will come of this, but that doesn't mean that they will not stop doing it. It doesn't mean that someone wouldn't organize a ritual assassination if they believed that would achieve the purposes that they wanted. So, your belief you can control. Never underestimate the belief that other people may have in these.
Is this part of, just pause you real quick, is this part of the kind of concept that to elicit the kind of action that you want, you have to tell somebody first? You have to get their either witting or unwitting permission that they are somehow involved in whatever your scheme is to karma gets thrown out over and over.
It's a way. Well, one idea is that by having the profane, by having the unaware masses observe these things and only perceive it vaguely, they are being brought into it on a certain level. They're witnesses to it. They're witnesses to what it is that you've done, even though they don't necessarily realize the full import of what's happened in in this particular circumstance. But let's go back because Downard is more than just King Kill 33. And you mentioned that earlier, was there something in his childhood that made him paranoid? Well, okay, there I would refer to you in some ways, which is probably the main published work of Downard, is an autobiography. It was published by Farrell House by Adam Parfrey back in the early part of this century, as the Carnivals of Life and Death. Okay, you can find that on Amazon. It's still available. And that basically covers Downard's life, I don't know, from infancy up until early adulthood, up until he's in his mid-20s, I would say. There's a more recent work edited by Adam Gorightly called In Search of the Great Whore. I'll try to explain what that means later on. That carries that on a bit further. So one of the things that was discovered, because Downard's works they basically fell into the hands of nothing really much was published in his lifetime, and other elements just sort of one person got this manuscript, someone else got something else. There were different versions of the manuscripts. And so In Search of the Great Whore continues on the autobiographical part up maybe to the late 1930s, just I think about 1937, 1938 is the last period he's talking. So Downard's born in 1913. He was born in Ardmore, Oklahoma. And that's an area that was kind of interesting to me because my mom was born not in Ardmore, but she was born in the area around it. She was born on a farm, not far from Ardmore, Oklahoma, a couple of years later, which is always kind of intriguing to me because it could mean that at some point when she was a girl, when they went into Ardmore to buy something, that she could have walked down the street and passed James Shelby Downard. I don't know. I just take a certain perverse delight in that type of thing. So he was born into, his father was an asphalt expert, which meant that his business was the James, and by the way, his father has exactly the same name. So James Shelby Downard, the writer, is James Shelby Downard Jr. His father is James Shelby Downard Sr. And this, at a certain point, this can lead to a certain amount of confusion. There have been people who've run across references to the father and have assumed there's only one guy with that name, so he must be much older. In fact, that was something that someone used to argue that James Shelby Downard in the 70s wasn't a real person because they were just using this other person who had been born years before. So there are two of them, at least that. And they will go, and in the reference to their names in newspapers and elsewhere varies a lot. So sometimes it will be James Shelby Downard. Sometimes it's J. Shelby Downard. In some cases, it's just Shelby Downard. Some cases they get it turned around and it's Shelby J. Downard. All right. At one point, his father just becomes Donald J. Downard. Donald. I don't know why, but he shows up in the census as Donald J. Downard, but only for a short period of time. I've still never figured out whether that was just some sort of strange mistake, although how you turn James Shelby Downard into Donald J. Downard, I don't know, or it was a temporary expedient on his father's part to disguise his identity. So why he would want to do that? Well, maybe we'll come back. There are a lot of strange things. So his father paves roads and streets. And he actually holds a couple of patents on asphalt, the sort of macadam material he put down. And it connects him to two things. It connects his father to a couple of things in Oklahoma. And one is the oil industry, which is big because you got to have oil before you get asphalt. And then the other is the vagaries of Oklahoma politics in the early 20th century. And until I started, digging into Downard's roots, that was one of the things that, I would never pay any attention to it because why? Unless you were really interested in Oklahoma politics. Again, my mother came from Oklahoma. I never remember her talking about Oklahoma politics. But the interesting things about this is that Oklahoma was throughout this, we're talking about the teens and into the 20s, even to the 30s. It's a one-party state. It's a new state. Doesn't come around until 1906. It's thoroughly dominated by the Oklahoma Democratic Party. There seems to be relatively little in the way of any sort of Republican presence there. So the governors are all Democrats. But they're divided into factions. There's a lot of factional infighting which goes on. And that factional infighting is very clearly connected to two other organizations. One is Freemasonry. Almost every governor and any person in any position of political importance in Oklahoma in that period was a member of a Masonic lodge. And the other is the KKK, which especially in the 20s exercised considerable political influence in the state house and in the legislature. And so you tended to have people, they're all Freemasons, but they tend to be either those who are kind of pro-Klan or anti-Klan. So one of the things that if someone was curious you could do is that look at Oklahoma governors in the 1920s, and you'll find out that in that short period of time, two of them are impeached for different reasons. So it's a volatile political landscape. You got the Klan in the background. You've got Freemasonry everywhere, and then you've got another figure who's not a governor, but the one that Downard's father almost certainly in some way would have done business with was a fellow by the name of Cyrus Avery. And Cyrus Avery, for much of this period, was the head of the Oklahoma State Highway Commission, and he was also the head of something else, the Albert Pike Highway Association. Okay. So here again, if you don't know who Albert Pike is, you can Google it, and you will find more stuff about Albert Pike than you wanted to know.
What state was Pike from? Somewhere in the South.
Well, he's originally from, I think, Massachusetts.
Right.
He's actually a Yankee.
Okay.
But then he spends much of his time in South Carolina.
Okay.
That's where he eventually settles. But he also is connected to Oklahoma. Because during the Civil War, Albert Pike was a prominent American Freemason. He was a Confederate general. Mm-hmm. He may have been, he's usually often considered to be one of the founders of the original KKK.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I'm not sure there's a piece of paper where you can prove that, but all indications are that he was there at the founding, even if he was not the primary founder. And until very recently, there was a whole statue of him in Judiciary Square in Washington, D.C., one of the few Confederates so honored, put up by his fellow Scottish Rite Freemasons. So Albert Pike usually figures in the conspiracy sphere by being the author of a kind of Masonic Bible. It's not that, called Morals and Dogma. There's a copy of it right over there. So, yeah, which I found at a garage sale, by the way. It is a largely impenetrable work about the meanings of all of the numerous Scottish Rite degrees. It explains what they mean and the mythical background and the rest of it. And, you know, you can make sense out of it in that way. But some people have argued it's this kind of treatise for revolution and subversion.
There's one quote that gets pulled out all the time about like the 3 world wars or something.
It's not in there.
No.
Okay. It's not even where it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be that the 3 world wars, supposedly discussion of how we have to organize 3 world wars to manifest the future that we want. That again, the wars are themselves sort of rituals that will be carried out. That supposedly occurs in correspondence between Albert Pike and the Italian Freemason Giuseppe Mazzini. So sometimes it's called the Pike-Mazzini letters. And there is some correspondence between the two of them. But the letter, the date on the letter that suggests never discusses anything. The 3 world wars is never mentioned. What they are very hostile towards is the Catholic Church. No big surprise. You know, that's not that unusual in Freemasonry. But it's another one of those things that when you look, there's no there. Okay, so yeah, I guess you could say there's another magical letter somewhere with the same date, and this has all been disguised. Well, yeah, you can play it that way if you want to, but I'm just saying that if you actually look, it's not there. And that Morals and Dogma is, for anybody from the outside, it is a lot of mumbo jumbo about the meaning of degrees, and there could be some deeper meaning to them, but I have to admit that it eludes me. But that's just me in some cases. But Albert Pike is, again, himself a kind of significant figure in the idea of modern American conspiracy. He gets roped into all kinds of things, fairly or unfairly. So it's interesting, though, as to why in the early 20th century, an American highway engineer in Oklahoma would decide to name yet the Albert Pike Highway Association, but that's what it's called. And the Albert Pike Highway Association will eventually give rise to maybe the most famous highway in America, which is Route 66. So if you're wondering, well, Cyrus Avery, well, he, not only was the head of the Oklahoma State Highway Commission, not only was he the head and founder of the Albert Pike Highway Association, which planned on building all these highways, he's the guy who is called the father of Route 66, which itself was, by its own admission, a Masonic undertaking.
No.
That perhaps is a topic for another day.
Yeah.
The occult roots of the American Interstate Highway Association.
Oh, that would be...
Or highway system. And that's why it's 66. It was supposed to be Route 60, but they wanted Route 66 because that has mystical significance. It's 2 times 33.
Oh, man.
So... and all sorts of things. For instance, they also measured, within the Albert Pike Highway Association, you measured the distance in Scottish miles, not in English miles.
Okay.
So,
well,
I didn't know there was a Scottish mile, but there is. It's
yeah,
longer than an English mile. So,
well, I was the historian for WashDOT for a number of years and got way off into, as you have to, the history of the interstate, system. And was it 1916? Everybody has to get DOT set up, and funny you should mention Oklahoma and McAdam. My grandfather's from Oklahoma, and he was an asphalt salesman in Texas. So it was, anyway, that sounds like another.
They could have done business with Downard Sr. So his father was, and if you're looking through newspaper records, one of the things I found is that Downard Sr. got major paving contracts, Oklahoma City, Ardmore, of course, that was where they were based, but also in Tulsa. Mm-hmm. And some of those were contentious. So there were articles in which someone argued that I gave the lowest bid, but somehow Downard got the job. So there were court challenges to getting, which, if you were well connected enough. So he was a significant player in the paving industry in Oklahoma, which brought him into connection with Avery and others. Avery is involved in state politics. He's a prominent Freemason. I've never seen anything that Avery was connected to the KKK. But to show you just the environment in which Downard is growing up, and also where he might have gotten some of these ideas, maybe the most controversial governor in this period in Oklahoma was a fellow by the name, I think, of Henry Johnson. And Johnson is governor for a fairly short period of time, I think between like 27 and 29. He's one of the two that are impeached. He was very close to the KKK, member of that organization himself. But as part of the justification for impeaching him, some of the things that were brought out was that he had a female advisor, sort of his personal secretary was a woman by the name of Mamie Hammond, also known as Mrs. Oliver Hammond. So she was his private secretary. I don't know, maybe his girlfriend. They don't quite go into that. She was, among other things, she was the head of the women's auxiliary to the Ku Klux Klan. Okay. There was one, and she headed it. She had bake sales for it, the whole thing. But much more interesting than that, was that she was, in terms of being Governor Johnson's advisor, she was his spiritual advisor. She admitted teaching him techniques of auto-hypnosis so that he could communicate with the spirit guides and thus develop more effective governance and legislation. Okay, so this was the governor who essentially was attended by his own private witch, who taught him to communicate with the spirits to help him guide the state. All right.
This might be too off topic, so you can say move on, but why does it seem like every time that there's... We were talking about your own personal experience in family situation last week. Why is there always some kind of... Is this like a holdover from spiritualism in like the 1880s, 1890s, like all these people? Or is everybody not really this great Southern Baptist? Like, I just have this image that everybody is some kind of, church-going,
Well, they probably do go to church. but it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't, have a seance in the governor's office and communicate with spirit. I mean, if you can, that really seems to depend upon the individual, but I think there are different layers to this type of thing. That is, there's the outward sort of Christian context. I mean, one of the things that we consider to be normal is that you have some kind of Christian religious affiliation and you go to church. Well, that covers a lot of bases in that regard. It would certainly take any kind of scrutiny, but there are other things that can fit underneath that perfectly well. People can very often, human beings are very good at holding seemingly two contradictory things in their mind at any given time. Somebody, I don't remember who, actually argued that that's the real human genius, is the ability to be inconsistent. And their actual statement of that is the one thing that AI would never be able to mimic, is that AI would seem to be incapable of holding two contradictory ideas in its mind, to the extent it has one, simultaneously. It also comes down as to whether or not it worked. So, I mean, why would he spend his time doing that? Why would he listen to her if he didn't get anything out of it, if in some way he wasn't able to convince? So, you've got, what have we got together here? What do we know that we've got there? You got the Klan, you got Freemasonry, you've got spiritualism and magic in the whole sort of context of Oklahoma society at this point in time. And I think it's reasonable to assume that Downard's father, being a prominent businessman, in particular in connection to things like in the petroleum industry and highway construction, was somehow involved in that. So then that takes us back to little Shelby and his traumatic childhood. So what Carnivals of Life and Death, what the first and main part of his autobiographical work actually discusses, is this, on the one hand, completely unbelievable, and yet on the other hand, weirdly, morbidly fascinating description of a kid who's constantly in jeopardy. So apparently, as he describes it, he was born to be some kind of ritual sacrifice himself. And throughout his childhood, his parents, his mother in particular, it would seem, is setting him up to be killed in some elaborate ritualistic fashion. Okay. So it's just one little adventure of his after another. And he's quite devoted to, he doesn't have that much connection with his father seems to be gone a lot, as you might expect. And he's absolutely devoted to his mother, which, reading through this, you can pretty much tell that, it's your mother who's trying to get you killed, because she's the one who's saying, I need you to go to this address over on this street and pick up a package there or something like that, or I need you to go with this person. And he'll go there, and then it will just devolve into some fantastic tale of like a 6-year-old, lured into a house where there are these elaborate sort of Rube Goldberg murder machines that are up. And he always manages to get his way out of it, either by shooting his way out.
As a 6-year-old.
As a 6-year-old, okay. Yes. He has his father's pistol, and he's killed several men by the time he's 10.
Okay. Oklahoma.
And they're all, they're all of these sort of, Ku Kluxer bad guys, who are trying to do him in, but they never do it in just some sort of straightforward way. They just don't run him over with a car. I mean, if they wanted to kill a child, it would be relatively simple to do that. But no, it has to go through these sort of it has to have a ritual attack. It has to be done in a particular place at a particular time in a particular way. And that's always their undoing, because in addition to packing heat, he also is very good with dynamite. So, there are things that the whole houses are just blown up, and he always walks away from this. And it's, there are things like, like killer clowns, I think, who were devoured by pythons. It's just all, you can't really see this happening.
Yeah.
But I did actually, again, in trying to figure out to the degree to which, to find the sort of real record of Downard. So we got here on the one hand, you've got his seemingly fantastic, unbelievable autobiographical experiences. So one of the things that I decided I was going to do is just to go through, look through newspapers, public record. First of all, find out whether he was actually born when he said it, whether this is a real person, which he is.
I hope you found a clown being eaten by a python.
I did not find any newspaper story of a clown or of some sort of, Italian. It's like stuff out of Pinocchio.
6-year-old.
Okay. But what I did find was a story. It was a newspaper that I think this is in the early 1920s, and it's in Dallas at this point, because around 1922 or 23, the family relocates to Dallas. They leave Oklahoma. And it's a story about some kids getting themselves into trouble because apparently a group of children, including one little Shelby Downard, age 10, they noticed a penny stuck underneath a sewer grate. Now, pennies were worth more at this time, apparently, so they wanted to get to it, and they couldn't see what they were doing, so one of the kids said, well, I'll get a box of matches. Could have been him, and they light a match, and of course what this did is that it set off this pocket of sewer gas, which was an explosion which blew the grate off, and one of the little girls, it was recorded, ran running down the street with her dress on fire.
Okay.
So that's something that actually happened in his childhood. And that's not the same thing as, trying to be chopped up in some sort of giant mousetrap that someone has built inside a closet. But it did show that there were some exciting things that happened in that. And you can wonder to what degree did that sort of experience then get, one could argue something like that scared the bejesus out of him, and then that evoked other things. But that would only be a time. That would just be an ordinary day for the child James Shelby Downard, as he describes it. No, he just goes through childhood avoiding one set-up murder after another. That's what will lead him later on as an adult to argue that he was a pharmakos, a sacrifice, the ritual goat to be sacrificed. And that was his whole role. That apparently was why he was even conceived and born. And that's apparently why his mother was trying to make all of this work, which never really. And she persists in this until the time he's an adult. She's always getting him jobs or saying that, and she's always saying, you have to do this for me. Okay. If you don't do this for me, you don't love me. You know that and he'll, even though he knows something bad is going to happen, he'll go ahead and do that. So if one was to assume, just for the sake of argument, that most of what he's talking about in terms of his childhood experiences actually happened, that would make you paranoid.
Yeah.
Okay? You can only go on so long with people trying to kill you before you would, get a little hinky about anything going on. But if not, then you can just dismiss it as this litany of sort of,
this is just the kind of personality.
It's just paranoia. Okay, he's lost his mind as his wife, the one who will later be termed the Great Whore.
Okay. Oh no.
Okay. That his wife, his one and only wife that I know of, would later say about her first husband, he lost his mind.
Okay.
But that's where I wanted to compare these two things. I wanted to take what he was saying. So in the context of his autobiographical writings, he names places and people, things that he did, schools that he attended, and the rest of it. So there are a lot of things you can sort of go through and check. And what I found was that almost all the people he mentions are real people. They're basically who he says they are. Someone, the guy that eventually his sister would marry, business partners of his father, the place they lived. The people he mentions are real. Now, he often takes those people and places them in strange situations, but he's not inventing them, and he's not inventing the places he lived. There's actually a huge amount of experience he had that he doesn't talk about. So he attended, I think, he never completed a college degree, but at one point or another, he attended 3 different colleges. I think he makes kind of vague reference to one or two of those. But that was kind of interesting, is that there are things that you would assume that he would mention that he doesn't. So that then raises the question again about how crazy is he? Because his recollections of, again, time and place and people are pretty good. And he does seem to get things, what I might find, let's say, in a newspaper record doesn't jive in the exact year that he mentioned, but it's it's the same sort of variation you might find in anybody's memories. So he's not so mad that he's completely hallucinating his life. Most of it, the basic components of it, he seems to remember quite clearly. So where does the crazy come in exactly? I mean, where do, and there can be, and crazy things can happen to people. So remember, this was a kid who blew up a manhole, okay, along with other ones. So where does this change come in? And there was the key to that, to me, or at least an important clue, was that in the newer autobiographical writings that Adam Go-Rightly discovered, Downard mentions that at some point I realized that the memories I had of my life weren't the real memories. So as an adult, he seems to have increasingly come to believe that what he remembered wasn't real, and that he began to remember other things. Now, this is one of those things that's not unique to him. I mean, there are other people who believe that, that my memories have been tampered with to some degree. And that's what he believed, that at some point his actual memories had been covered up or removed and replaced with false ones.
Does this include the fantastical, my mother's always trying to kill me, or is that after?
Well, my mother's always trying to kill me, even though, by the way, he never seems to admit that to himself, that his mother's trying to kill him. You may have realized. If you're reading it, you can figure this out. Don't go there, kid. Don't listen to her. But he goes ahead and does it anyway. No, that's what he thinks are the real memories. What he's writing are his effort to recover memories. So his autobiographical writings, in a way, it seems to be this kind of self-treatment, where I'm going to, I don't know how he does this. Does it just come to him? Does he dream them? I mean, a lot of the stuff is very dreamlike. But that's what he thinks are his actual memories, although I think at one point he's not really even sure that those are entirely correct. But he believes that most of the memories that at one point he had were ones that had been imposed upon him in order to cover up what had happened to him previously, that he has been a victim of mind control.
Okay.
So I'm not sure he ever uses that term, but that's basically what he's been talking about. And if you look around, that's one of the things you can find. There are other people who believe exactly the same thing. I have met people who believe exactly the same thing. They've never heard of James Shelby Downard. And this is part of why his work attracts a certain amount of attention. And it's not why it interests me. So just in case anybody's interested, I'm pretty sure that my memories, with some lapses, the ones I've had, I don't think any of them have been tampered with or replaced. But I certainly have met people who seem to sincerely believe that has happened to them. So this isn't just something that's unique to him. And this is why people, in reading this, there are people who've read Carnivals of Life and Death. And to them, it's this kind of revelation. It's like, oh, yeah, okay. I understand what it is that he's talking about, because something like this has happened to me. And there is, in comparing notes with, other people who think that their memories are okay, there is something. The only way I can describe it is that in reading through all of this sort of litany of paranoia The type of stuff that on one level you cannot believe. You can't really accept that this would actually have happened to someone in real life. You still come away with this kind of eerie sense of familiarity with what he's talking about. You know, again, it's one of those things that it sounds crazy, and it sounds crazier and crazier still, back to ordinary crazy. But then at some point, it doesn't sound crazy. It sounds like maybe you've heard that somewhere before.
Mm-hmm.
There is this kind of odd deja vu thing about it. And I think that's why many people tend to become interested in his writings, because they think that they can actually find something in their own experience by looking at his. But what I wanted to do was just figure out whether the guy was real and how much of what he was talking about was real, and most of it is, and there are many things that he does not talk about. So let me give an example, because there are lots of things you can go through of something that a particular case, which I think works well to describe what he's doing. So his family moved from Oklahoma to Dallas, and then by the late 20s, by around 27 or 28, they moved to Fort Thomas, Kentucky, which is basically right across the river from Cincinnati. That's right to the north of that. And that's actually back closer to where the Downards came from. So his father isn't from Oklahoma. His father is from Wapakoneta, Ohio. So the Downards actually come from Ohio. Mm-hmm. So they've moved back into that sort of neck of the woods. One of the things I think is interesting about that is the time they leave Oklahoma and then leave Dallas and sort of give up the whole sort of asphalt business coincides with that whole period in which Johnson became governor, and there was this sort of chaos, and there was this huge influx of Klan influence. And Downard seems to believe that well, he actually describes the KKK as a quasi-Masonic fraternity. Okay, his argument is that at least in that particular place and time, those two organizations were very closely connected with each other. And certainly there was a great deal of common membership between the two. So keep in mind, I am not indicting Freemasonry as being an extension of the Ku Klux Klan or the other way around. I'm just saying that in that time and place, it was extremely common for a man to belong to both of those organizations.
I mean, I'll back you up here by my mother had told me on many occasions, my grandfather, the one from Oklahoma, was a Freemason, turned Shriner. Many of the men in her family were Freemasons, and the whole, verbatim, it's like you can't be anybody of any importance in, early 20th century Texas or other southern states without being part of the lodge, the local lodge.
It was the Union card to the middle class to a certain degree, but also it opened up opportunities. Well, that's what it's supposed to do.
Right. Yeah.
So I wonder if the family's movement some distance away to northern Kentucky didn't have something to do with wanting to get away from all of that. And that's also this period in which his father briefly becomes Donald.
Okay. Oh, well.
So that might have been, and there are also occasionally these intimations that doubted that one of the reasons why he is a sacrifice, one of the reasons why all these terrible things are happening to him, was to expiate the sins of something his father did. Right. His father had screwed somebody over in business or had violated some oath or something, but you do get the sense that they were kind of running away from something when they moved there. So it's 1931. Downard's a young man, and he has this guy shows up, as they always do, someone about his own age, and he goes, "Hey, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to go to the cemetery, this particular cemetery, and I need you to recover some grave goods that were left in my father's tomb."
Okay.
So I got to keep in mind, this is a cemetery in which, a family crypt. So it's a crypt, a tomb, which is partly underground. It's got a door, you go into it, and I guess all the coffins are stacked up. And there is stuff stored in there. grave goods. Sometimes there were things that would be buried with people. In other cases, they just seem to have used it to store things. So someone he doesn't really know asked him to go to a cemetery that he's unacquainted with and to go in and retrieve some grave goods from a guy he's never heard of, a Dr. Simon Kramer. That's also kind of interesting. Now, Simon Kramer turns out to be a real person. The Kramer family is well known. Kramers are Jewish. This is a Catholic cemetery. Things can happen, but nonetheless, that's a little bit off. Oh, and by the way, Dr. Simon Kramer actually lives until 1940. So in 1931, he's not dead. Therefore, he would not. There might have been a family tomb, but he wouldn't have been in it.
This is just storing his future grave goods, right?
Well, I mean, this is, again, one of those places where he's talking about real people.
Right.
I mean, the cemetery is real. The family is real. Dr. Simon Kramer is real. Well-known figure. But he has it off. He has him dead in a period in which he wasn't. So Downard goes to the tomb in the cemetery. And the first thing that he discovers is that the door to the tomb is booby-trapped. In fact, this is the story of his life, of going to some place and figuring out it's booby-trapped. Man, he's been doing this since he was like 4 years old. His mother's sending him to go pick up something, and there's a booby-trapped cake, or there's a door, or
pull out my gun.
There's a trap door that's going to open underneath him. And so he figures out that the way this door would go in is that he would open it, and a huge spike would come out and impale him. So, but he gets around that. He fools, and so he gets inside. And he finds all of these books, and he finds this weird machine. And it's, he describes it as sort of like a typewriter on a table with lots of buttons and lots of lights and keys. And it has a metal label on it, which describes it as the Dayton Witch.
Okay. Like WITCH?
Yeah, Dayton Witch. Sort of like, Ditch Witch, but in this case, it's Dayton Witch. And Dayton, Ohio is not that far away, so, it could be. Well, if you look through the description he has of it, he starts it, and it starts chattering and doing all of these things. But what it sounds like is a German Enigma machine.
Okay.
It's a code machine. And that sort of sent me down a rabbit hole, is that, the interesting thing is the German Enigma device was invented in 1918, and in the 20s, the company that produced them actually produced commercial versions, and those were sold in the United States.
Okay.
So, this was just a way of sort of keeping secrets by placing information in code. So it was sold to companies, industry, as a way of protecting industrial secrets. But so one of the things I was looking for was it possible that Enigma machines were being purchased in Germany and then marketed by an American company as the Dayton Witch? I could never find any reference to Dayton Witch other than the one that went back to Downard's story. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there were other machines there were other coding machines, which also, keep in mind, are the precursors to computers.
Well, when you were describing it, that's what I thought.
This one sort of goes in, early computing machines. In fact, there was an American computing machine company. So there were things very similar to that produced. So that a machine of that kind could have existed
30s,
in 40s, a tomb,
right,
in or rather in Fort Thomas, Kentucky in 1931. It's possible. It's nothing beyond the realm of possibility. But except for the fact that I think it was the Dayton Witch, it might have been, but I think it was that also had a tag attached to it. Now, because it has to. And on the tag was written something like property of Brunel University, Brunel. That was kind of interesting. Yeah. I'd never heard. So what was Brunel? Well, Brunel University is a British university, technical university. But the interesting thing is it doesn't exist until 1966. So now keep in mind, Downard's writing this in the 1970s.
Right.
And even though Brunel University would have been new, and he was a guy who read fairly widely and all sorts. So it's entirely possible that he ran across a reference to Brunel University. But then why he would take the name of a university that didn't exist until the late 1960s and attach it to a mysterious machine found in a tomb in Kentucky,
guarded by a spike,
in the early 1930s. I don't know. Is this just him getting these things mixed together? Of course, some people have looked at this and they go, oh, well, time travel. That's what it's got to be. It's a machine from the future.
Well, and by the 1970s, he's in his 60s, right? If he was born in 13, right?
Well, 63 be 50.
Okay.
All right. 50. So he's in his 50s.
Okay.
So that's this one weird thing he comes across. But then he also comes across these books, which are all attached to like these library tables with chains, like at some point they've been placed on display. And he notices that they're on different topics. Some of them are on occult topics, and some of them are on other things dealing with metaphysics, and some are dealing with mathematics, physics, things he can't understand. But the author of these books is James Shelby Downard. So there are these mysterious books that he's never seen on various arcane topics with his name on them.
But his father...
Well, one of the things he'll later do is go ask his father as to whether or not he'd ever written any of these books. And his father, he says, well, sort of, we get tense and give him a weird look and go, no, I don't know anything about those.
Okay.
Now, an interesting detail is that, again, from newspaper records early on, when his father was a young man in Ohio, he was very interested in theosophy and metaphysics.
Okay.
He apparently belonged to some sort of metaphysics club. He gave public lectures. So his father did have some sort of background, at least in kind of popular occultism.
You found newspapers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. And there's a thing of him mentioned giving a public talk about that. And I can't really tell from the artist whether he's there to denounce the pernicious superstition of theosophy or he's there to promote it. But he knows what it is, and he's talking about it in public.
Mm-hmm.
So... I don't know, did his father mention that at some point, and then that gets turned into, his son's crazy mind?
Sounds like a mix-up of all kinds of different
books into a tomb. But you can see where this is sort of dreamlike. It's almost as if this is taking little elements from his life, and he's dreaming these things and putting them together in these various forms. And maybe that's originally what it was. Maybe he's interpreting dreams as reality. So this is so he manages to get the grave goods, take them out, avoid the spike, the whole business, find all of this stuff. But then the interesting thing is that in his other unpublished writings, there's a different version of the story. So it takes place in the same place, around the same time. I think it's still the same Dr. Kramer, but in this case, it's not in a cemetery and it's not in a tomb. This stuff is found in a barn. The Dayton Witch is in a barn that he goes into. And that's kind of, I think that's important to me because it suggests that here you've got two different versions of the story. So how do you get that? I mean, if something happened to you and you realize it, there's only pretty much one way you can tell it. The way that you come up with two different versions of the story is either you're just revising the story. I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of something that would be deliberate fiction, where you're just sort of changing the setting. Maybe the first time it was in a barn and that wasn't good enough, so let's change it to a graveyard with a magic, with a killer spike. Okay, that'll work better. Which would suggest that Downard in some way was sort of deliberately crafting these things. Or, at the very least, it shows that his so-called recovered memories varied. That he wasn't getting the same story all the time.
There's elements, but they're pulling in other memories and kind of
other memories, or he's just making it up. He's deliberately concocting this. So you can find other kind of instances of the same thing, at least slight variations in the story. Another interesting tale that comes across in the later autobiographical stuff, the stuff that's in Search of the Great Whore, deals with his meeting with Leon Trotsky in Mexico around 1937. So, Downard's in Mexico, and one of the things that's pretty clear from his work is that he spent a considerable amount of time in Mexico.
Okay.
He's acquainted with certain things in terms of culture and even sort of Mexican native mysticism that I don't think you just get from a book. He learned about these probably firsthand. Now that would interested me because, you mentioned the word Trotsky and
Right,
I'm all
yeah.
ears. Another object of my unhealthy fascination. So they met, or he claims that they did. Well, he's got him in the right place because Trotsky's in Mexico in the period he's staying. Trotsky's a real guy. He's in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
He even mentions, I think, the place where Trotsky has his office or the house, and that's right. He's got that right. He mentions the names of a lot of Mexican communists that are associated with Trotsky. He's got their names right.
Okay.
He knows who those people are. Now, again, those aren't anything that he couldn't have read in books or in newspapers, but he has the right people. But then he actually describes his meeting with Trotsky. So somehow someone says, hey, you need to go there, meet this guy. And he goes and he finds out that, Trotsky is paranoid and afraid of assassination, which he was.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is that the door to his office is electrified. So Trotsky has like a little switch under his desk and he can turn on and off the power. And so he can turn this on and anybody who touches the door to go in will be electrocuted.
Home Alone style, yeah.
And of course, Downard, in his super Downard way, figures this out, turns the table and ends up electrocuting Trotsky. He doesn't know if he's dead. He just leaves him smoldering on the floor and walks out.
Okay.
So apparently he wasn't killed, we'll guess. But that's, so he electrocutes Trotsky. Where else could you come up with this? He also describes in 1937 as being a government agent of some kind assigned to protect Franklin Roosevelt during a visit to New Orleans where there's an attempted assassination.
Okay.
And again, it's that FDR does visit New Orleans around that night time, but not because Downard gives an exact day, but not that day. You can go through FDR's, diary, his day book, and he was somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Unless, of course, it's all been doctored to prove this. But again, he's kind of close. FDR in this period was in New Orleans. I don't know if there's anything about an assassination attempt. He also makes these stories about going to Cuba again as some kind of quasi FBI agent. Because by this time he's become, he's met Franklin Roosevelt, who showed him the $1 million gold certificates. This fantastic bill.
Right.
Now, again, supposedly the U.S. Treasury has never produced a bill with a larger denomination than $100,000. So there are $100,000 gold certificates, or there were, never put into circulation. Biggest bill ever supposedly put into circulation was a $10,000 gold certificate. But Downard's works are full of references to the $1 million gold certificates. And there are counterfeit ones, so he could probably have seen one of these. But this is, this is the stuff that he's being offered to pay him. He's enrolled in some sort of, secret squirrel organization like the Baker Street Irregulars, sort of government agents. But he's his spy, in other words. And he goes to Cuba. And, and he kills a bunch of guys in Cuba who are trying to kill him. It's like a gunfight in downtown Havana.
Is there any, did you come across any documentation that would suggest that stuff is somewhat?
Well, he did go to Cuba in this period. So how did I figure that out? Well, eventually in 1935, he marries. He marries a woman by the name of Mary Ann Parton. She's from Memphis. Okay, she's a model, and she goes to, So this is in the middle of the 1930s. She and her sister are sort of, fashion models for a while. He meets her in Fort Worth. So he's back in Texas for some reason. I don't know why he goes there. He meets her, marries her, and she will then subsequently be the woman that he will dub the Great Whore. Because suffice to say, their marriage does not go smoothly. But they're married for 10 years. So they actually are formally divorced in 1945, but then they'll get back together. So I found out that around 1951, for some reason, they're living together, apparently as man and wife, in Phoenix, Arizona. So there's a fairly long relationship there. So one of the things, this woman will then go on to, after she divorces him, she remarries a kind of Hollywood screenwriter and hotel manager by the name of Alan Whitwer. and then she becomes Ann Whitwer. And then you can find lots of things about her in Southern California, sort of society columns. So she's very prominent in LA and around San Diego, a hostess for various hotels. Now, what Downard alleges is that he married a girl who then becomes a Masonic sex sorceress.
Okay.
Because part of Masonic sorcery are sex rites. They're sort of orgy. They're sex parties that she was then the kind of hostess of.
Sex magic.
Now, interestingly enough, later on, even into her 40s and 50s, she's a professional hostess.
Oh.
At private clubs.
Ah.
I'm not saying that he's right. I'm just saying that, later on in San Diego, she was the social hostess for the, Kon-Tiki Yacht Club, which featured the Pagan Room. Mm. Oh, they also had a yacht called the Pagan. And she was
wow.
So,
okay.
Interesting stuff. But she's the one who later then told her daughter that, who asked her about her first husband, and she goes, well, he lost his mind. So he marries Mary Ann Parton, who then becomes Ann Downard. And they seemed, they don't always seem to be living in the same place. So I kind of suspect that they had a kind of rocky marriage and they may have split up and gone back and forth. During World War II, he's what appears to be a civilian employee for the Army. Because I can't find any kind of actual enlistment records. I mean, he's working for the U.S. Army, but he's working in a medical facility basically as a lab assistant bacteriologist. He also graduates from Medical Technical College. Okay. Which he attends, I think, around 1940. A pretty well-known technical college, whose name is going to elude me now, in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And he's a radiologist. Okay. Actually works in a hospital for a while. So he actually has real background in medical technology. Mm-hmm. And so they also, he and Anne for a while, own up a kind of hotel bar in the Florida Keys. Okay. So this again is like 1939, 1940. So they're living in the Florida Keys near Key West, and they own, I don't know, something like the Sand Crab Inn. That's not the name of it, but it's a roadhouse. Okay, so it's got little cabins, people can stay there, and it's also got a bar. Okay. And what she later again mentioned to her daughter was that, oh yeah, one of the more fonder things she remembered about married was when they lived in the Keys and they used to make trips to Havana. Okay. And so that was one thing, is that, they actually, so at least he had been to Cuba, so in that period.
Well, I mean, the fact that this guy seems to be getting all over is interesting.
He moves around a lot.
Yeah.
He ends up in all kinds of places, only about half of which he actually mentions.
Is there any reason that he gives for going to Mexico or being in Mexico?
No.
Okay.
No. He also makes reference at one point of running into a lot of trouble in a Mexican border town, but he never says exactly what that is. Okay. But then I've also found that in the 1960s, he's recorded as living in Columbus, New Mexico. That's the same town that Pancho Villa raided. It's right down on the Mexican border. So that's a Mexican, but that's 30 years after he supposedly got it. That was supposedly sometime earlier. But what was he doing in Columbus, New Mexico? Yeah, and he never mentions being there, although he makes these allusions to. At one point, he basically makes some sort of vague allusion to being held prisoner in some sort of government desert facility. Was that? I can't find anything in Columbus, New Mexico about that. So, Anne. They divorce in 1945. She eventually remarries Alan Whitwer. He then becomes she's sort of his assistant in managing this very posh hotel, actually a set of bungalows near San Diego, near La Jolla, California, called Hotel del Charro. Okay. So during the 50s. So after she divorces Downard, she links up with this guy. And what's interesting about the Hotel del Charro? Well, that's where J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson spend their summers. because it's very, it's next to the racetrack, and Hoover liked to play the ponies, and so he has his own little cabin there that he spends his summers in. But it's also a favorite watering hole for Texas oil men like Sid Richardson, who actually owns the hotel, and then also for guys like Sam Giancana, who's a regular visitor. So go to mention a typical summer day in the Hotel Del Charro in 1954. You got J. Edgar Hoover over here. You've got Sid Richardson, maybe the Hunt brothers, and then Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli. Okay, we're saying. So you got members of the mob. And if that's not enough, you also have Edward Teller and various Manhattan Project physicists who like to stay there.
Interesting. Wow.
What are all these guys doing?
Yeah.
So Alan Whitwer, Downard's ex-wife's future husband, will come to the conclusion on his own that Del Charro is where the JFK assassination is plotted and organized, that this is where all the plot, this is the centerpiece. Now, so the interesting thing is that, Marianne Parton, a.k.a. Ann Downard, a.k.a. Ann Whitwer, a.k.a. the Great Whore, ends up being married to two men, both of whom become JFK assassination conspiracy theorists.
Oh, no.
They're married to the same woman.
Wow.
Make of that what you will. But the way I came across... So they were actually just sort of looking, again, going through newspapers and trying to look for Ann Whitwer. It was confusing because there's another Ann Whitwer in California in the same period. It's completely unconnected. But I find a mention that her daughter, little Meg Whitwer, attended a birthday party. And, she's the daughter of Alan and Ann Whitwer. And I go, they had a kid.
Okay.
Now that kid would have been born, and so she's no older than I am, so maybe she's still around.
Yeah.
And sure enough, I found where she's living. I'm not going to say because I don't want people bothering her.
Right.
But she's still very much around, and I just cold called her and said, "You don't know me, but I want to ask you, something about your mother, about her first husband, and I'll just say 3 words, and you can decide whether or not you want to call me back." I got her answering machine.
Yeah.
I said, "James Shelby Downard." She called me back. She said, I never met him. My mother said a few things about him. She said he lost his mind. They made trips to Cuba. And she goes, here was the typical thing my mother said about him. She came downstairs one morning and he was sitting at the table reading an Italian newspaper.
Huh.
And, of course, she asked her mother, well, what was strange about that? She goes, well, he didn't know Italian. And thinking about it, my response to that would be, how do you know he didn't read Italian?
Yeah.
Maybe he was... See, that would be one of those questions. Was this just an act of madness? This is a guy who doesn't know Italian, who's reading an Italian newspaper, right. Or it was some talent that she didn't even realize that he had. But it's... but again, they get back together in 51 in Phoenix. So around in that period, he's an inventor, and he's invented an ultrasonic device.
Okay.
I think he calls it the ultrason, oddly enough. And so he's working in ultrasonics, and he's decided that ultrasonics is a solution to everything.
Is this supposedly related to his background or his technical background?
Yeah, he describes himself in some cases as a bacteriologist.
Okay.
So in 1944, they're back living in St. Petersburg, Florida. So he's a bacteriologist. Anne is his nurse, and he's running a business as Dr. Downard as a bacteriologist.
Okay.
Then after they split up in 45, he ends up back in Oklahoma City. And there I found ads in the newspaper. There was a thing in Oklahoma City called the Klassen Clinic. It was a private hospital. And it was a private hospital in that it dealt with what it generally addressed were alcoholism, drug addiction, and female problems. But then they had also added a new category, since this was now July 1945, battle fatigue.
Ah.
And they had added a new person to their staff, Dr. James Shelby Downard, who was an expert in electroencephalography. He attaches electrodes.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Okay, that's the interesting part. What he did was he treated guys with PTSD, basically,
with electric shock.
and he did this by attaching electrodes to their head and zapping them to make those bad memories go away.
Oh,
Now, think about that.
Right? Yeah.
So later on, what is he later claiming?
Yeah.
People erased my memories.
Right.
What was it that he was doing in 1945 in the Klassen Clinic?
Right.
Zapping people's, or pretending he was zapping people's memories away.
Well, when you first told me this, and he's writing in the 70s, I'm thinking, well, a lot of the memories, and I know a lot of the things that you've told me about in the past, predate kind of CIA, interest in mind control or some of these MK Ultra things like that. So is he suggesting he's a precursor to that? Like he's involved in some other...
Well, that's one of the things he never talks about. I mean, in none of his autobiography does he ever mention working for the Klassen Clinic. He never mentions electroencephalography.
Weird.
Yeah, you'd think that he would note that.
Yeah.
But then there are other things. I mean, there's a few years, what is it? It's a couple of years later, there's a newspaper report that he's picked up in the bus station in Tulsa by the vice cops, and they seize a briefcase that they think is full of pornography.
Uh-huh.
Now, some of that could have been, Adam Gorightly thinks that this could have been some early version of one of his manuscripts because in their unedited form, they're not exactly pornographic, but it depends on what part of them you were reading.
You're going to write
I mean, vice cops could have picked up one page and figured that out. Mm-hmm. So what was he doing in Tulsa? Why was he carrying a briefcase full of... I mean, that seems to have been fairly typical of descriptions of carrying this briefcase around. So somehow he gets busted by vice cops in Tulsa on some sort of potential morals charge.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe he looked at them too long in the bathroom or something. Who knows? But it's just another weird thing.
Yeah.
In Downard's, itinerary of weirdness. And so he goes from the Klassen Clinic. So that's in 45. He doesn't work there he never stays in any place very long. Mm-hmm. So by 46 and 47, he's already in Phoenix and doesn't seem to have come back into his life yet. And this is where, again, there's a fairly long newspaper article which discusses his invention of the ultrason and how ultrasonics will make plants grow better. They'll cause rain in the desert. But then also he's noted that he's found a new way to make better rocket fuel.
Okay.
out of this. That he's because he can use ultrasonic energy to bind and... Now, that again is interesting because one of the key ingredients in solid fuel rocket, thanks to Jack Parsons, is asphalt.
Really?
That's basically what he found was the answer to that, is you just sort of mixed it with asphalt, and what you want it to do was you want a controlled explosion.
Okay.
You don't want it to blow up, and
Right.
you don't want it to burn slowly.
Asphalt.
So... Yeah, so asphalt is somehow involved in this, and so he's using and of course his father was involved in asphalt, so that carries over that kind of tradition. And so he's writing up that he's got all of this stuff. His partner is a former Air Force pilot who later then becomes a chiropractor. Okay, and they've worked up this whole sort of like new rocket fuel recipe and all these things with ultrasonics, and he's written all of this up and he sent it to the Air Force. And that then begins a little saga on its own. So he's taken he's written up his research notes, he sent them to the Air Force, and then the Air Force never really gets back to him. And when he inquires about that, they argue, we sent all of this stuff to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Okay.
Because it has to be Wright-Patterson, because everything weird goes there. Right. And they got lost. We don't know what happened to them. Sorry about that. All the stuff you sent us, we lost.
Please send again.
Now, he doesn't believe that, apparently.
Right.
He thinks they've stolen it. And then you don't hear anything more about it until I think it's in Okay, so that's like in 46 and 47. And then at some point in early 49, there's this little article in the Phoenix newspaper about 3 men escaping from the local mental hospital. One of which is James S. Downard. It's him.
Okay.
So he ends up in the bin in the meantime. And then apparently they never actually tried to escape. They just got out and wandered around the grounds and quickly kind of returned to it. And the interesting thing about that is that in his later autobiographical writings, he does mention, he mentions that, oh yeah, there are these people who get caught up in this sort of, government mind control stuff, and they don't know what's going on to them. And of course there were these 3 characters I know of who were, a certain number of them who got away, but of course they didn't actually get away. Well, that's what he's describing, but he's not putting himself in it. He's not saying this happened to me. He's talking about something that seems to have happened to someone else.
Right.
But what he's describing is the same event that's being discussed with his name attached to it in the newspaper.
Okay.
What I couldn't find out, because, these records are...
Right, yeah.
I could determine that was him, okay, because I gave the date of birth and the full name, that apparently that was the inmate that was being patient. Why don't we describe it? Okay.
It's a
person,
pretty much.
He was the guy who was in the loony bin.
Right.
But they couldn't tell me how or why he had been committed or for what. He doesn't seem to have been there very long, because by 50 or 51 he's out, and now he's back with his former ex-wife, and now they've become good social friends with architect Frank Lloyd Wright and his wife Olga Vanna.
What? Okay. Oh, because this is when he's living out. Didn't he move to Arizona? Or something? Okay.
Yeah. This is when they have Taliesin
West.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, how did Downard and his wife and
weird
and again it was Meg Whitwer and his daughter, later by Alan Whitwer, who said she said, did you know about their relation? They were really close to Frank Lloyd Wright. And I go, no. Tell me about that. I go, oh yeah, it was. So Shelby and Olga Vanna shared a common interest in metaphysics. Exactly what metaphysics? Well, I don't know, but somehow that's how it got into being. And then there was, she also mentioned this thing, and they were really into like breeding Doberman Pinscher dogs. I think that's what it was.
Okay.
It never mentions that either. So there's the whole Frank Lloyd Wright connection that goes in. Then she disappears, leaves Phoenix, goes to Reno, where she's the social director for a Reno casino and hotel. That's where she meets Alan Whitwer, and then goes on to be her life as, the hotel manager, wife, and social hostess, and Masonic sex sorceress from there on. And then he apparently stalks her. This is where stalking the great whore comes in. Right. I don't think he necessarily wanted to call it up. So the whole image you get of him in this letter, sort of post-45 period, is that he's roaming around the United States in an Airstream trailer with a .45 under the seat and a pet rabbit.
What the hell?
And because he'll later form his own little group called the Belligerent Rabbit Society.
Okay.
Which some people and I have attempted to revive. Okay. So we might do that. And so you would be invited to join the Belligerent Rabbit Society.
Thank you, the name alone.
But no one's entirely sure whether the rabbit was real or, like Harvey, was a rabbit that he imagined. I don't think there's any reference to it being 6 foot tall. But supposedly he had a pet rabbit, ill-tempered pet rabbit, a gun. And so he's in the mental hospital in Arizona, and then at some point, well, it goes on to the rest of the 50s, he ends up in Alabama. And then he goes into a medical partnership with a chiropractor. And once again, he's doing some sort of ultrasonic, he's beaming stuff into people's heads. He's giving them special medical treatments that involve electricity.
Sure.
And he's, by this time, a very big critic. He writes letters to the newspaper talking about, what a scam ordinary medicine is, and how chiropractic and alternative. So he's become a practitioner of alternative medicine.
Okay.
Never mentions that. And then that's in 55, and then he just sort of vanishes.
Okay.
And the next place I can pin him is mentioned as living in Columbus, New Mexico.
Okay.
But in the interim, he spends some time in the Western State Mental Hospital out in Tennessee.
And you are able to...
That's now where his mother... Well, he mentions that. He mentions the director of it. I can't remember the guy's name now, but the fellow who was a former Army psychiatrist.
Okay.
Who was the director of and you can kind of date this because that guy took over, I think, in 54, and he left in 64, 65. So Downard is mentioning him as the director, so he must have been there somewhere during that period. It's, again, unclear how he was committed there. There's some vague suggestion, and I'm not even sure I can remember how I got this vague, but is that he was committed there by his family. So keep in mind, his mother is still alive.
Mm-hmm.
His father is dead. He's been there for a long time. His mother is still alive. He has a sister. They're fairly respectable people now living in Memphis. So it's not, it would kind of figure that the family might have had him put away for a while. So I don't know whether he was there from the whole period of, say, 56 through 66. He spent 10 years there. He was only there for a short period of time. I don't really know, but that's this whole blank period in that. And early on, you could kind of tell that at some point he just, until suddenly he's living in St. Petersburg, Florida, in a trailer park, and is making friends with different people who then will disseminate his writings, that there was this gap. And my first idea was that, he sounds like a guy who might have had a drinking problem. Mm. So maybe that's what it was. Maybe alcoholism, and, he was put away in a private hospital. And he actually worked in a hospital at one point, a private clinic that treated those things. Mm. So I don't know. I still don't know what, exactly how he was committed in either of those cases or what he was committed for. In the earlier case, back in the late 40s in Arizona, of course, there were those who argued that, he's comes up with this miraculous invention. He tries to show the Air Force, then the Air Force basically steals it. He raises a stink, so what they did was to throw him in the bin to shut him up and discredit him. That's not beyond the realm of possibility. I mean, it could happen. What happened later on, I don't know. So it's again one of those kind of mysteries about what he's doing. His living in Columbus, I think, he makes lots of... He never mentions Columbus that I know of, but he does mention El Paso. He becomes quite fixated on El Paso and various things about its sort of Masonic legendary, but then also he'll make comments about Los Alamos and the Trinity test, which he also believes, by the way, was a Masonic ritual. Yeah. And that he was carried, the 33rd degree of latitude and everything, the way it was the Trinity site. Yeah. The whole sort of giant, what was it? This large sort of metal container, which was at the first, at the Trinity blast, one of the initial ideas. One of the things they weren't sure was whether or not the implosion device was going to work. Mm-hmm. So, you've got this plutonium core, and then, watch a non-physicist try to describe physics. So you've got the plutonium core, and you've got the explosive lens. It's surrounded by TNT, which is going to explode all at once and compress all of this stuff together. Mm-hmm. It has to work exactly right. So one of the early concerns, along with possibly setting the atmosphere on fire and destroying the Earth, was that the blast would go off, but it would be incomplete and it wouldn't create a critical mass. And then, you don't want to do that up in the air because you're just going to spread plutonium everywhere. Right. So what the idea is that what we'll do is we'll create like a giant steel thermos bottle. and very, very thick, and we'll put the bomb inside of it, and if it works, they figured it no problem, it will just evaporate the whole thing, and if it doesn't work, it will contain the explosion, and none of the plutonium will get out. Well, they dropped that idea, and this thing was huge. There's still pieces of it laying out there, and again, it looks like a gigantic steel thermos bottle, and instead of moving it, they just left it literally underneath the sort of gantry. But then they also did not think, they hoisted it up. So if you actually look at the tower in which you have the bomb at the top, this big jug thing is then hanging by a chain underneath it. Now, the basic story is that it was just too heavy to move. Nobody wanted to get out there and move this 250-ton thermos bottle somewhere else. So we just left it there, which then begs the question, well, why did you just leave it on the ground if it's unimportant? Why was it held on the chain? Well, Downard has an answer to that. Downard's answer is that it was filled with something, that it was all part of an experiment, that it was filled with living matter, and it was an attempt to create a homunculus. Okay. And this was an act of alchemy,
right?
And that what you were going to do was that there was some sort of living stuff inside this, and it was going to be subjected to tremendous amounts of radiation, and that was going to create some kind of new magical being. This would be the ultimate act of alchemical experimentation. That's Downard for you.
Okay.
So I mean, he can see things. So I don't know, but the jug was there, and who knows what was inside of it. Probably nothing, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. You might figure that, well, we got this thing there, I don't know, let's put some bananas and some chickens and a few what would happen? Okay, if there was a cow in there and we set off a bomb and it's inside a big metal, what would happen?
Sure, yeah.
So
that could believe that.
These were people, scientists. They had inquisitive minds.
So
I suspect that there was probably something more involved than just an empty 250 ton
if they're going to keep it around
bottle that was there. But so they're just an infinite, and then the more you learn about him, as usual, it gets the idea that you look at the strange, and the stranger it gets, and that's certainly the case with Downard. Is that there are these things that he records about his life, and there are these things that he edits out, and there are things that he attributes to other people. And he's really, in some ways, he's you can't, or at least I can't really just dismiss him as an uneducated loon, because he might be a loon,
right?
But he's actually does have technical background. I mean, in the late 40s, he actually corresponds. Not only did he send his ideas about the use of ultrasonics as a miracle cure for everything to the Air Force, he also wrote to the former Vice President Henry Wallace.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Wallace is in Wallace's paper. There's the letter from Downard there describing all of this stuff.
Interesting.
It's not clear whether Wallace ever answers him, but he knew that Wallace would be interested, because Wallace, for instance, was very interested, for instance, about the use of radioactive materials to enhance plant growth.
Okay.
He's an agronomist, basically, and so that's one of the things he was doing, is he was actually getting radium and putting it in flower pots. So
stunning results.
There's this all an endless amount of weird stuff which is going on. So he knew people that you wouldn't assume that he would know, and it's not. I mean, one could, with a little Hollywood screenwriting finesse, you could argue that you could turn this into a story where Downard was an inventive genius who stumbled across things that other people wanted to keep quiet, and so they basically branded him crazy, locked him up in an institution, and zapped his memories away so that he wouldn't come into that. Again, that's a movie scenario, but
Stranger Things.
What is life with a movie?
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing that really sort of made him interesting to me, is just figuring out, again, is this person real?
Yeah.
How much of their story is real? Where does it lead in all of these different directions?
Well, it's interesting. I'm maybe this is how you feel or felt. I'm stuck between, did he actually lead a life that was of consequence in some of these regards. Talking to Trotsky, or the Havana stuff is interesting to me too. And not to say that people. When did Cuba close down? 53 or Castro? When did Castro?
59.
50. Oh, yeah. Really that late? I just think of The Godfather, I guess. Was he a complete crazy, or did he actually have a life where he led, and did some fairly normal things, and yet kind of comes back later and embellishes to the degree that is really not believable?
Well, it's not unusual for people to embellish things. I think that tends to go along. And sometimes even for the individual involved, it can be difficult to whether, the embellishment is usually a better story, so that's the one you're likely to remember. Well, let's take something again like Trotsky. All right, so if you actually go in the events he described, did Trotsky have an electrified door? Well, I've never seen anybody else mention that, but it's not impossible.
Right.
I mean, what he's describing could be done. It's kind of a Rube Goldberg type of protective device, but I guess you could do it. More intriguing to me is that he brings up Trotsky at all, and since there seems to be pretty good circumstantial evidence that Downard was in Mexico in that period, they could have met. I mean, I'll just leave it. It would be intriguing to me is if he had actually, for whatever reason and in whatever context, he had actually met Trotsky at that point in time.
So the Trotsky connection in Havana, and then there was something else, maybe FDR, made me think of two possibilities. One, so is there any connection ever that you ran across, aside from he's a civilian employee during the war, is he connected to the military at all? Is there any kind of...
Well, there's a directory. So one of the things that used to be, most towns used to publish, some of them still do, is a direct, it's like a phone book, but it just gives people's addresses and usually their occupation. So I think it's from 1943, and is it Knoxville? So he's living in Tennessee. I'm not sure it's in Knoxville, but and it actually gives his address, and his address is way out in the country. Okay, it's not a military base, so he's not on base. But it basically is his employer is U.S. Army, but it doesn't give a rank of any kind. It just says U.S. Army, and he's living up in the hills, right, just like a couple of miles away from the Georgia line.
Okay,
but he's also is always involved in medicine at this point. So I was looking around and figured out, well, what's right just south of the border is Fort Oglethorpe, and there's a big U.S. Army medical hospital there.
Oh.
And as a medical technician, I mean, if nothing else, as a qualified radiologist, that's probably so. I can't find any kind. Well, one of the things I can't find for him is a young man's draft record at the early part of World War II. There should be one of those. You would have had to fill one of those out. I mean, one may exist, but don't see it. There's no record of any kind of, nothing comes up in enlistments, veterans, any of this. Usually there would be some indication. So what else he could have been was a radiologist, a civilian employed by the U.S. Army at Fort Oglethorpe.
Right.
Which, putting the pieces together, that's what I think he was doing there. And then in 1944, the war's still going on in 44, he and Anne are together in St. Petersburg, Florida, where he is Dr. Downard, and he's billing himself as a bacteriologist. So again, if he was in the military itself, how he would then have gotten out in 44 and then be in private practice.
Well, I'm not knowing enough about the practices during, enlistment during World War II, how would you, it just seems odd that you wouldn't be enlisted in some way, or even, be a radiologist, but you're still in the service, unless there's something exceedingly wrong with you.
Yeah. I mean, maybe they let him go. Maybe he left on his own. But apparently he's separated from the Army. And while World War II is still going on,
sure,
he's now a bacteriologist.
Okay.
He also at one point ran, and I think this is again, he goes back and forth between Arizona and Florida frequently. And there's a whole thing about he's running a lawn care business.
What does this guy do?
Now, really, there's an article in the paper that he, James Shelby, and he's working in some sort of, sounds like, estate or something, and they dug up an old pirate's pistol under a bush.
Are you kidding me? Come on.
And that made the paper. It's like, oh, we dug this up.
This would be a good.
And then there are and he has ads in the paper, and it's saying that like plants, just like people, need energy, and it's his ultrasonic thing.
Okay.
And what he's apparently doing is he's taking some sort of ultrasonic device and waving it over your lawn so it will grow better.
Okay.
So real thing or con?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, was he? Remember, I found that thing in the archives I sent you, and it's some, kooky American inventor type figure down in Mountain Home or something like that. I mean, does Downard fall kind of in that like eccentric inventor? I'm gonna,
You could, but I mean that wasn't. I mean, he claims to he claims to have discovered the secret of ultrasonic energy, and the ways that can be applied both to cure people. I mean, this was the whole, that people just like plants need energy, and now he was simply taking something that he would later use in treating human patients, and now using it to treat someone's lawn. But so is he a kooky inventor of, or is he a con man?
Right.
Looking at it, these are all just sort of,
sometimes they go hand in hand.
Quackery.
Right.
So I think that's a term that you might use. That he sort of verges on the idea of medical quackery. Again, he's a bacteriologist in St. Petersburg, Florida. Well, I don't see that he has any background. Where did he get the background in bacteriology? He does have a legitimate degree as a radiograph technician, as a radiologist. How that translates into bacteriology, I don't know. That may well have been what interested him in ultrasonics. So
you're off, Mike. That's all.
Oh, there we go. That's better. There we go. So he could have been. Well, there's the question for you. Is he a fraud? Is he a con man? Is he a kook? Or is he a legitimate inventor? But that's a question that you can ask about a lot of people that, usually any kind of legitimate inventor is partly a con man and a kook. And I'd even put people like Thomas Edison in that. I mean, he had to convince a lot of people to put money into something he wasn't all that certain about. So there's always that kind of question. And there's not an answer to that. I mean, there's no way that you can say that he's pick whichever version you like and stick with that one. But I think he is a human mystery.
Well, how does he come around to, I mean, did he jump on the JFK conspiracy bandwagon? Was he early to it? I mean,
well, so the next place you see, so there's that 1966 reference to him living in Columbus. That reference actually comes up in his mother's obituary.
Okay.
So his mother dies. His mother, if anybody had him committed, if that was the case, I suspect his mother did.
Okay.
I mean, after all, she was always trying to get him killed in one way or the other. So why she sounds like the perfect mother that would have him thrown into an insane asylum.
Yeah.
So she dies, and so it just mentioned that her son, James Shelby Downard Jr., lives in Columbus, New Mexico. No other explanation. But it puts him into that right area. So he's got to be out of the hospital, living out in the desert in a trailer. And then the next place you really hear about was around 1970 or 71. He's back in St. Petersburg, Florida. He's living in a trailer park in his Airstream. He is a regular visitor to Haslam's bookstore. Haslam's bookstore was a big bookstore. It was a popular meeting place. And that seems to be where he runs into William Grimstad, who later would become a writer, a number of things, and a Nazi.
Really? Okay.
Well, I guess, kind of.
In the 60s?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the Saunders brothers, and one of them was there's this debate over, but the Saunders brothers, Charles Saunders, and their father is a university professor, but they are connected to the American Nazi Party.
I was going to say, I feel like I know the name Saunders, but they go back to the 30s, right?
I don't know. I've only really encountered them there.
So this is all like
and Jack Kerouac. Okay, so he meets Jack Kerouac in Haslam's bookstore.
Okay.
And, well, let's go back to what we know. Downard was a regular, he hung around the bookstore.
Sure.
Kerouac hung around the bookstore.
Sure. Yeah, not out of it. Yeah. I think the Frank Lloyd Wright connection's weird.
So the idea that they would meet, but then you've got other people who argue, oh yeah, Kerouac was at, like, he was eating hot dogs over at the trailer with Downard. So you have that image in your mind,
right? Yeah,
of James Shelby Downard sitting with his pet rabbit on his lap, expounding on King Kill 33, grilling hot dogs while Jack Kerouac and the Nazis are sitting there.
Wow.
So, and Downard certainly was in his particularly raw writings. He uses a lot of ethnic slurs.
Okay.
For everyone. I think he's fairly democratic about that. He doesn't seem like anybody.
Equal opportunity.
Okay. But if you can think of any particular nationality and whatever sort of slur, which is that's usually the way that he comes across. So, but there's nothing in that. I mean, he's not a fan of the Klan.
Right.
I mean, he always sees them as being, the sort of, he sees them as sort of being the thugs of the Masonic sorcerers.
Okay.
They're sort of a low life characters. So there's nothing positive there. So how he would have ended up with the Saunders and Grimstad and then another guy who becomes involved in this is Michael Hoffman. And Michael Hoffman is also of, I think Hoffman would be fair to say has strong right-wing.
Is this the historian? Who am I thinking of?
Well, he actually lives in Coeur d'Alene, or did.
Who am I thinking of? I feel like I know the name, Michael Hoffman.
Well, he's the author of various books, one of which is one I have up here, which is Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare.
Yeah, okay. I thought he was a historian.
Well, what's an historian?
I don't know.
Does he have any academic degrees in history? Not that I know of, but that doesn't mean that he's not necessarily.
I don't know how I've never read. I know the book. Yeah. I downloaded it. I didn't read it.
It's interesting.
Okay.
I'll say no more on that. And I've never had, even though we live relatively close to each other, we've just never reached out, and there's probably a reason for that, because I'm not sure exactly what we would have to talk about. I would have lots of questions to him about Downard. I'm just not sure that there are questions that he would necessarily want to answer, and I'm not really sure what the exact nature of that whole relationship. My impression is that Downard by this time was a fairly marginalized character. I mean, look, he's in his 60s by this point. His mother is dead. I think his sister, initially his only survivor is a niece. I'm not sure that he doesn't have much of a family, and in all likelihood, they probably don't want to have that much to do with him.
Yeah.
I think he might well be described as the black sheep of the family, for good or bad reasons. And, he's, probably still pining for the great whore.
Maybe I'm jumping.
He's taken advantage of by these people. That would be my praise. That they're the guys who were. Pardon?
Because of the book? Because of the JFK?
Well, I think they kind of. I think they see things in that's sort of useful to them.
Sure.
But then I'm not. Well, this is purely my kind of take on it. So you imagine this early 1970s Florida, and you're sitting around, and let's say around the table near the barbecue, you've got Downard, maybe you've got Kerouac there, you've got Grimstad, and then you've got two other people at least who are described as Nazis or somehow in that field. Well, any place where you've got three Nazis, I would argue that one of them was an FBI informant.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know which one of those was. I would bet that one of them was.
Yeah.
So that, is the government still keeping their eye? I mean, was that what their purpose was?
Downard.
Okay, as a way of keeping an eye on him by people who otherwise would never be connected. You could never say that the government was keeping an eye on him, because certainly they would never have any, like Nazis or quasi-Nazis in their employ, unless, of course, they were a plant that was doing that, which just has the other Nazis around. Now, again, I'm creating a movie scenario, but, something like that could be. I don't know any other particular way to explain. He also travels around. He visits a couple of other. So he stays with some people for a while in Lake Havasu, Arizona. That's sometime, I think, in the late 70s. Mm-hmm. And then later on, he is in Oregon, not too far out of Portland, and he's staying with this other couple there. And I wish I could remember what their names were, but what suffice it comes down to is that they're the same people under different names.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so at one point they're living in Lake Havasu, and I don't know, they're like John and Judy Smith.
Yeah.
And then later on they're living in, I think, Escanaba, Oregon, and they're Jim and Susie Jones. But it's the same couple. Or it's the same guy, and he may have changed wives by that time.
Okay.
There's also some sort of strange. I think the guy also at one point had been convicted maybe of pedophilia. But
so he's trying to.
So okay, what's so he just sort of and they help edit his papers. Okay, they're actually given credit for sort of editing his stuff. Well, who are they?
Yeah.
Right. Who are these people who, the guy moves to another state, changes his name? Maybe that's to, get away from some sort of past unpleasant conviction for something.
Right.
Or maybe that's just his job to do. In the same way that Downard mentions at some point being in Southern California, supposedly, chasing the great whore. He goes down and, around San Diego, around Mount Palomar. And that's where he mentions that, he made contact with sort of local occultists, and they told him about rituals that were being held at Mount Palomar Observatory. And then he realized that his ex-wife was the one who was sort of the hostess for these things.
Is that what the book is about? Or
which book?
The Great Whore.
No, that's Adam's idea for a catchy title.
Oh, okay.
Which,
I thought that was the second book.
When I talk with Meg Whitwer, I didn't say, "Oh yeah, I'm telling you, I'm working on this book called The Great Whore. It's about your mother." So, no, I didn't think that was the way to go at it.
No, probably not.
That is Downard's term
Pet
of affection for his ex, who he was convinced again is a Masonic sex sorceress who was engaged in organizing orgies all over the case. He thought that she had implants, in her vagina. That made her constantly horny, or that they had done all kinds of things to her, and that she slipped him drugs, and he thought this had been going on as far back as when they were living in the Florida Keys.
Yeah,
or that was his later. You could interpret it this way: is that they got married. It wasn't that happy of a marriage. Maybe there was, maybe she was constantly cheating on him. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe it was the other way around.
Right.
There was and then later on in this sort of fever dream that he goes into, this turns her into this kind of, whore of Babylon,
right,
which is what he's referring to in this case. Or maybe what he's saying is exactly what happened. That's unlikely. And it's the type of thing that you'd rather not have to be true. But you got to face the fact that in a case like that, you can't actually disprove anything that he's saying because you don't know her or anything else that was going on.
Right.
And by the way, for God's sakes, Meg Whitwer, if you hear this, I'm not saying that's true, but we all know he's crazy. All right. It's just like your mom said, but you don't know what to make out of this.
Right.
So on the one hand, it's one of these things where, again, you've got to avoid being credulous to the point that you get taken in by his madness, if that's what it is. Because what he's saying still sounds crazy to me, and I find it unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
But On the other hand, you can then just become dismissive. You can just say that, well, he's just nuts, so everything he says... Well,
Right.
the point is that demonstrably everything he says isn't nuts. Only some of it is. And that's how you can't clearly parse one from the other. My basic feeling is that this is a guy who somewhere along the line had something very traumatic happen to him. I mean, something happened to him. And whether that something happened to him was that he was drug off into some government mind control facility and MK Ultra'd out of his mind. This is also, keep in mind, this is all happening in the 50s.
I was about to say, if he ended up in mental institutions, right? He was committed. He disappears for 10 years. I mean, there was all kinds of, de-patterning or whatever it was, all kinds of different, programs going on in these state hospitals that were being funded through the CIA, through different... What was the other one besides MK Ultra? I mean, there was a lot, but...
MK Ultra becomes a catch-all for... I mean, MK Ultra sort of is phased out. That term is phased out in like 63, but then it basically continues as MK Search, MK Naomi, and then there are a whole...
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, this stuff is starting 53... early before.
Well, it goes. I mean, MK Ultra comes out of Project Artichoke, Project Chatter, and those go back to 49 at least, probably even earlier than that, probably 47.
Okay.
So I think again, I've mentioned to you that there's an FBI report on a meeting that's held in 49 in New York City.
You showed me the document,
and where you have a couple of guys from the CIA, one of which is lie detector guru Cleve Baxter, who's giving a presentation to these people in a private home, by the way, about the wonderful potential uses of hypnotic suggestion. And of the potential uses of hypnotic suggestion that they see is the ability, as they put it, to remove or implant memories in people's minds. And that's why I find that interesting, because that's essentially what he's talking about. And now you actually have people who, on a theoretical basis, in the same time period, are talking about, this is what we can do. We could potentially take memories out and put false memories in.
If there wasn't that 10-year gap, or these repeated committals, to institutions like this, I would think the guy's just lying. But the way you describe a lot of his memories, and how the first story about, I went into a crypt and these magical things, and then it becomes a barn. With that, in your mind, that maybe he was subjected to some kind of early, I don't know, shock therapy or whatever. He was, whatever was going on with kind of experimentation within these facilities, that makes it seem a lot more plausible, because they're not out of like you were saying, they're not out of the question. These things did exist. There were Enigma machines or early computers. The time period's off. It sounds to me like somebody with fragmented memories that's
trying to put them back together.
Right.
Yeah, I think that could be one explanation for it, is that he's trying to assemble things, and so he doesn't always get the time or the places or the names right. But most of it, most of the, where he was, who I knew, that much is there. And maybe only parts of it are scrambled. But, and then I again come back to that when he was working for the Klassen Clinic in 45,
right,
as an electroencephalographer, that's what his job was to essentially help people get over bad memories by attaching electrodes to their head, which means he knew something about that.
Well, is he coming in contact too? I think in terms of who's the guy everybody knows about now? Frank Olson. The first, he was not a virologist. What was he? But it was biochemical warfare or something. And he gets dosed at some party, right, in the early 50s. He's part of the CIA.
He's a CIA contract
contractor.
scientist,
Yeah.
and the general story is that he, took an experimental dose of LSD and
Right.
jumped out of a window.
Right. Or was
the other interpretation of it by his family is that he was given the dose of LSD and thrown out a window.
Right. Yeah.
Because he either knew something he wasn't supposed to know, or he was being difficult.
Yeah. There's a documentary that basically that's the case made. It's like he was having a breakdown and they didn't want people to know. So they James Forrestal style threw him out of a window. The point I'm trying to make is if you're near to these things, it seems like so inevitably you're kind of more susceptible. So if he's doing I can't say it.
It is difficult. Electroencephalography.
Thank you.
I had to practice that.
Anyway, I'm just, he's at a military base. He's around this stuff. I don't know. I'm just taking giant leaps, but maybe he's aware of this stuff. Maybe he knows the folks who are kind of involved in some of these early, if it's happening in 49 and he's there in what, 44, 45, not 45. He's in,
well, 45, he's doing the electroencephalography.
Okay.
By 46 and 47, he's experimenting. He's developing the ultrasonic stuff.
Sure.
In Phoenix. And that's then where he's communicating with the Air Force and with Henry Wallace.
Okay.
And then that's somehow apparently where his ex-wife comes back into his life. Well, she at one point is like working for the Arizona Public Schools. So it's the interesting thing is you see these people pop up in different roles. She's a member of Young Democrats for a while, but anyway.
Is there any like political overlay on this? Like, does he have, some connection to, like Trotsky? Is he some kind of, fellow traveler, or is there any?
No, he gives no indication of having any political interest one way or the other. What he basically claims is that from around the early 30s, he's introduced to FDR somehow through some kind, he also notes that, they're Freemason, and maybe a good one.
Sure.
And through this connection to the White House, through his family's connections, he gets recruited as some sort of semi-government agent. That's why he went to Cuba. That's why I suspect later on that he was in Mexico.
Yeah.
Because he never really defines why he's there. And he also talks about, this is like 36 to 37, he's talking about in Mexico, and he has a girl with him. So I had this girl with me who would later turn out to be not what I... Now, he's obviously talking about his wife. Because remember, he married her in Texas in 35.
Yeah.
So I assume, but he doesn't call her his wife. He never calls her by name. He doesn't say, oh, this is the future great whore. This is just a girl with me who would later prove to be treacherous. And he's, going back to the thing I mentioned ago, when he came, and I'm not sure when this was, in the 50s, maybe later, when he's sort of hunting her, and in and around San Diego and the area, and he goes and he's talking about these rituals in Mount Palomar, and supposedly he tries to follow her up, and this whole motorcade comes along, and he notices her in the car, and they try to run him off the road. Once again, attempt to kill him. Well, the thing is that the whole idea of rituals at Palomar Observatory comes up in other contexts.
What is Jack Parsons involved? Jack Parsons. Okay, thank you. All right, that's all right.
So it's like, oh, okay. Well, I've heard this. So he's mentioning something that. Well, it's funny that you would mention Mount Palomar.
And Parsons isn't like his interest in the occult is not well known until what? 80s, 60s.
Well, anybody knew anything about Jack? They knew. He never disguised. That goes back to the, late 30s.
Yeah.
Man, I think even before that. But that has to do with. This takes us off on a tangent, but Jack Parsons is another subject for another time. But Jack Parsons was most notably connected to the Crowleyite occult organization, the Ordo Templi Orientis, which had a branch, the only functioning branch in this period in Southern California, in Hollywood, and in Pasadena, the Agape Lodge. Before Parsons ever is connected with this, I think around 34 or 35, the head of the Agape Lodge, then Wilfred Smith, mentions that, we went down to Mount Palomar and we consecrated a temple. So the OTO at one point in time did hold rituals on Mount Palomar around the time that the observatory is being built.
Okay.
So, and by the way, the observatory connected with Caltech. Caltech is just infested with people besides Jack Parsons with occult interests. I mean, they're everywhere. All right. So, you never have to search around to find those things. It's just, it's like flies. They're just everywhere. So there is this, and then there was the idea that the temple or site, whatever it was, the ritual site that the OTO consecrated, then at some point becomes actually physically incorporated into the observatory.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I don't know whether somebody's just making that up, but they consecrated it. They said they did. Yeah. And the observatory was built somewhere near there. And then, 30 years later, or whatever it is, that Downard says he's chasing down his wife, ready to host a Masonic sex party at the observatory.
Well, when you led off with, his general thesis for the JFK assassination, the first thing I thought of was NASA and various planning around, significant dates and that are all associated with, one, Nazi holidays or Nazi, important, dates, I guess, but other like kind of Freemasonic symbolism tied to some.
Well, what's NASA full of? Nazis and Freemasons.
I know. That's exactly. So
and other people who aren't Nazis and Freemasons. But the beginnings of it, pretty much Nazis and Freemasons.
Right. Yeah. Well, Werner von Braun.
I can't. Werner von Braun.
Thank you. I can't speak today.
Was he a Nazi? Yes, he was.
Yeah. He's part of the V2 rocket.
Of course, his daughter taught at UI for years and years.
So I almost got to meet her. Yeah. Because she's, I believe her spouse had some environmental company here in the area. And anyway, there's a professor up there who knows them. And I was like,
she was very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. Never talked to her much about her dad.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I did commit the faux pas once of asking her whether or not he was, don't talk about, was your father a Nazi?
Yeah.
Okay. Did he really meet Hitler? Was he in the SS? No, she doesn't. That's her dad.
You're
all right.
Right.
So she doesn't really want to talk
And that's
about
the
that.
story I've heard. But the first thing I thought of was like, oh, interesting, Hayden Lake and kind of North Idaho. And, is there any aerospace, far right politics? Just all those things kind of.
The whole aerospace industry is sus.
Yeah, I know.
There's stuff that goes on. I don't know.
That's another topic. And
another topic.
I'll try to put that one together.
But yes, you do find these sort of weird correspondences between things.
Yeah.
And it's an indication of it. Well, it's just like the Palomar thing is that, well, what he's talking about sounds nuts until, wait, somebody else mentioned that before.
Sure. Okay,
from a completely different angle that wouldn't know anything about him. And that's one of the things that makes that sort of interesting to me, where you get the sense that it's just one person where the information is being kited. Mm-hmm. So it's basically one person who's mentioned it. This happens in history all the time. One person comes up with this idea or mentions it or tells the lie, and then everyone else just repeats it, and then it becomes canon.
Right.
But if you back engineer it, you'll find out that it all traces back to this one person. Whereas if you find that you got the same thing referenced by two or three different sources that don't really seem to be connected to each other, that should attract your attention.
So, I mean, you've already stated roughly that, something happened to him. He's believable in that sense, right? That he was a victim of MK Ultra, for lack of a better term, or was it?
Maybe.
Is it occult activities? Because this stuff with his wife, I mean, we haven't really explored too deeply about.
What's the difference between them?
That's true. Fair enough.
I mean, we always sort of seem that those two things are completely distinct from each other. So within the broader frame, we only know a fraction of what it was at MK Ultra or its successors were really interested in, because most of that stuff was gotten rid of.
Mm-hmm.
Which raises the question, why was it gotten rid of? Why was there an effort to systematically eradicate? Well, partly because, maybe it cost a certain amount of money, and also because it could be embarrassing or incriminating. A lot of it was illegal. Keep in mind, much of it was used on the unwilling testing of these things in different people. But, the guy who was one of the chief architects of it, Sidney Gottlieb, who I think was known as the Black Sorcerer within the organization. How did he get that nickname? So I don't think they were really shy about looking at anything in the same way that, this type of thing just gets extended later on when you have both CIA, the military, usually with the CIA behind the military, sort of urging them to do this, looking into things like remote viewing, extrasensory perception. Right. You've got all the stuff that almost certainly CIA or some other agency was playing guys like Dr. Andrea Puharich to, hold seances, try to communicate with aliens, ancient Egyptian gods, recruit special children and send them to a camp in the forest in Maine.
Right.
Okay. So all of this stuff was being done. And they're not going to leave any stone unturned. So again, it goes back to this basic principle, the Crowleyan principle of magic, which I know I harp on endlessly, but it's something you can go to. And that magic is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Mm. That is, making things happen by focusing willpower, energy. In other words, manipulate the same sort of things that would arguably go on. And, you could say that if indeed there was a King Kill 33 ritual, if JFK's assassination was some kind of ritual, it was to manifest it was to put energy into a future that you wanted. Mm-hmm. And that future included getting Jack Kennedy out of the White House, but that wasn't the ultimate goal. The goal wasn't just replacing a president. The goal was changing the whole course of reality from that point on. So just suppose, for the purpose of science fiction, that it was determined through secret experimentation or classified experimentation that one could, through certain applied means, ritualistic or otherwise, actually, even in some minute way, begin to affect the course of events. I'm not even sure how you would gauge that. I mean, how do you know you're going to change the future? Okay, unless eventually you get what it is that you want. But that if you could somehow do that, well, then why wouldn't you? I mean, that would be a tremendous thing to be able to figure out that you could achieve. The question comes down to what degree is reality, which is a pretty thin construct to begin with. I mean, first of all, material world is apparently all constructed on subatomic particles that don't actually exist. Mm-hmm. You got to think about that for a while. Right. If you take matter down to its smallest, it just isn't there anymore. It's just the potential for something. Or we don't know. All we really know is it's just not there anymore. Yeah. So that's the first question. How do you get something out of nothing? And it was it was like I think in the men that stare at goats, whether it's in the movie or the book, there's a guy who's constantly trying to figure out why he can't put his hand through a wall. Right. Because the wall actually isn't there. Yeah. I mean, the vast amount of it is just
empty space.
Yeah. So, but my hand is also empty space. So how is it that one piece of empty space and the other empty space
through will, you're supposed to be able to...
How can you do these things?
Right.
So you're beginning to play around with the basic components of reality at that point. So the first question would be is to try to figure out what physical reality actually is. Is it a hologram? There are people who now think that idea. I'm not sure I get that, but nevertheless, it's a hologram, some kind of construct. It's a collective illusion, or so on. Now, if any of those possibilities were true, the idea then that you could manipulate it becomes a lot easier.
Right.
because there's nothing which is real or fixed. So how do you manipulate something that at a certain level doesn't even exist, except that in some way, and the idea that reality exists because we're all in some way programmed to believe that it exists. It's a collective delusion. And it's a collective delusion held so strongly in so many minds at the same way that it becomes real. It's the thing which is made manifest simply through will.
It's the egregore.
Change the will, and you change the manifestation.
Yeah. I mean, that
sounds scarily plausible.
Yeah, well, knowing a little bit about, gosh, I wish I remembered the name of the institute, but, and I'm sure we'll run into other stuff like this because I know the CIA either runs programs through groups like this or they're, legitimately interested. But it was basically the guy argued that he could map the spirit world. So, and this was a CIA funded thing. The papers have all been released. I think they're on their website. But that's kind of the argument is like, let's do our best to get the interpretation of what is this reality, what is beyond. And part of, Russell, or is it Targ?
Targ, yeah.
Yeah. The remote, I actually ordered, oh man, it was the real big remote viewing book. But the Stanford Research Institute, that's part of the whole point of some of their work, right? Is to be, they end up traveling in time through remote viewing. And it's not like this is the definite future, but this is the plausible potentiality.
This is the way you could get it to do. Or you could go ahead and see whether or not what you just did worked.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
because if we just did this, then we should go back and it'll be different.
Yeah. And that's when you were mentioning some of this stuff, that's what I was kind of thinking. There could be the rote, or just, the basic, human inclination towards ritual, right? Like, what is religion except, like, think of a Catholic mass or something like that. Like, some of these things, say you do, the JFK assassination had to adhere to all of these different aspects of a ritual, if for no other reason than for us in our own kind of esoteric religious beliefs that this has to go down this certain way for us to be able to pass. And there's no deeper, like, we're going to affect reality. It was just, we have to absolve ourselves. I can believe that as well. It just seems just as plausible.
It could be, were there any number of people who might have wanted to have John F. Kennedy killed? Lots of them, actually. He was not ultimately that. The mafia had a grudge against him. People in the CIA had a grudge against him. J. Edgar Hoover hated his guts.
Oh, I've read enough about LBJ to think that
LBJ
most certainly he was involved.
Hated him as well.
Yeah.
So that's I'm not sure that JFK appreciated what danger he was potentially in.
Yeah.
He was surrounded by people, including his vice president, who hated him and probably wanted him out of the way. And interestingly enough, that happened. So you can argue it that way, that you don't need to have any kind of esoteric reason for getting rid of him. There were people who felt that he had either, robbed them of the nomination, or he was just too squishy and
soft,
too much of a simp to be president, or he had screwed them over in the Bay of Pigs, or had, taken all those dead people voting in Chicago and been elected, and then sicked his brother on us. There were grudges,
right?
But that's one level. So what you would need to make this work, that's sufficient on its own. That you have people who hate this individual and wish them dead and carry it out. But then there could be a higher level to this, which is simply using those people. They're the mechanism to achieve what it is that you want, but you have a much bigger agenda. Because it's not really this guy at all. It's not Jack Kennedy. He's immaterial. He is a symbol of something. He's the pharmakos. He's the sacrificial victim who must be killed in a particular place at a particular time in a particular way in order to influence the future current of events. And these people who actually do the killing are just errand boys.
Yeah. You're orchestrating this entire I mean, I've seen stuff, this is a very vague memory, but like the Prince, I mean, the whole Camelot thing, I think, kind of factors into this post hoc imagery of like, this was the sacrificial prince or lamb or whatnot. Maybe not lamb, but.
Well, there's an idea, which I may be a better description of, but it goes back to a guy, one of his ancestors, I assume, Gerald Fitzgerald. I think I've got it. Gerald Fitzgerald, who was, if I'm remembering correctly, was executed in the orders of Queen Elizabeth I in 1583. And that was a ritual sacrifice designed to initiate the British Empire. So John Dee supposedly has something to do with this.
Okay.
You got to kill this guy in this place, this way, at this time. And then later, centuries later, one of his descendants, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, must be sacrificed because he comes from a line of the sacrificial thing. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I don't put it past that someone would believe that.
It's not original. I mean, it seems like that kind of line of a family burden, right? A cursed lineage, etc. That pops up all over. Doesn't seem like it's just unique to the British.
Cursed lineage. I like that.
Yeah.
That's the whole idea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we put meaning where it doesn't need to be, right? Where a pattern recognizing species, your meaning making machine. Case in point, my wife, her grandfather passed away, I don't know, 60, 70 something. His father passed away in like the 30s. And so the grandmother, because they passed away, I think roughly at the same age, had put some meaning that like, oh, there's some connection there, but they both died, at 37 or whatever it was. To me, that seems like the same thing that some of this stuff revolves around, is that you're looking for patterns where there maybe is none. You're looking for, and that's what I kind of wondered about Downard at the beginning. It's like, is this person sufficiently off the rocker that they're pulling in, popular events and figures? I met Trotsky and I electrocuted him with a Home Alone device or whatnot. Is that what he's doing? But then the more you kind of unpacked it, the more I thought there's plausibility here. You can look at it and so it is a strange.
Yeah, there's more than just an insane individual.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe he was crazy to begin with, maybe he was driven crazy by events, whatever again crazy is. So, it goes back to, how does a person become paranoid? Well, either it just happens, so they get knocked on the head and these things happen. You can get a severe blow to the head and you can end up speaking French, or you can become paranoid. And how does that happen? Or you can have experiences that can continually push you in that direction. And I think that he had some legitimately traumatic experiences, that things happened to him in one form or another that shaped this whole kind of paranoid, fractured reality. But it's... How are we doing here?
Oh, good. I'm just making sure that's recording.
Oh, that's good.
Oh, yeah. Trust me. I hate to have just one device. I would love to have two set up. And that's what I usually do.
No, you can use that other one, but not today.
Well, yeah. Some other time.
So yeah, I think we've kind of
run it.
There's more than you can go into, but we've now gone into the greater meaning of what James Shelby Downard could be part of, and those could all be topics of some.
Well, that's where
future discussion.
Well, a lot of the things that you and I have talked about, and hopefully we'll record on. That's where I always end up, because it's not. I mean, I guess it is a mystery, a lot of these things, and there's so many avenues that it can go, and that's one of the things that I really admire about your research, because you're bound to the written record essentially, right? But a lot of this stuff doesn't tell you exactly what, or even close to what, you're stitching it together.
Well, that's what you got to do because you don't have that much otherwise.
Yeah.
Go back maybe when, the final point or not is the idea about the significance of things, whether or not there are patterns, whether we see pareidolia, whether we're seeing false patterns and things. I don't know. I mean, if you perceive a pattern, then there's a pattern. I mean, the pattern may not mean anything beyond that. But it goes back maybe to, again, a kind of central element in what could be called occult belief, which is a broad sort of thing. And in that realm, there are no coincidences, and nothing is insignificant. So the simplest way I think it was put is that everything that happens is an omen. Okay. That is, it is kind of a preamble to something else. So the idea that if you had 2 or 3 or more relatives that all died at 37, no, that does actually mean something. Now, the point is you don't know what it means.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to die at 37 or anything else, but it is telling you something. In the same way that anything, the shape of a tree tells you in some way the things that have influenced as it's grown, what has caused it to be that way. And that's one of those things that in terms of what could be called magical thinking, as the term's used in different ways, is to approach it from the idea that everything that happens is significance. Okay, that put it in a simple way, the universe, the world, whatever it is always talking to you. You're constantly being given information, and you're being given information about what's going on. You're being given information about what's already happened, and you're being given information about what's going to happen. And part of that, it was once explained to me, is you just have to shut up and listen. And you have to quit trying to interpret it or to wish it away one way or the other. And you just let these things happen. So the particular person told me that said, one of the things you always want to pay attention to are crows or ravens.
Oh, geez.
Okay. And I go, oh, they're all over the place.
I know. I was
okay. They're all over the place. What is that supposed to mean?
Trees all the time.
Yeah. So, but you should, but if you notice them or if they notice you should pay attention to that, because that almost always is a kind of tip off that not that in and of itself, but soon something significant will happen. So it's a way of saying pay attention. Pay attention to what happens next. And it may be something important or it may be unimportant, but this was an individual who spent most of who quite literally lived in a cabin in the woods somewhere, had a pet crow, okay, and and spent all day sitting on the porch watching what was going on. And you can, and I admit I've tried that on Kay for a brief period of time. I'm just sort of just paying attention to everything that happens, and assuming, keeping in mind that none of these things are random. There are no random events. And you can occupy your time. It's better than smoking cigarettes, but it can become quite wearing. You have to spend a lot of mental energy doing that, of constantly being aware of these things. And I think the other thing that it can do is that it can lead to a certain degree of paranoia.
Right.
Because it means in a way that to a degree that since all of these things are happening around you and you're being given messages or direction, which means you're constantly being watched.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily want to go there. I think it's just easier not to be aware of all of that. But do pay attention to crows, apparently.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's good.
And don't piss them off.
Well, you give them gifts. They can be your friends.
Yeah.
It just takes a while. Just give them buttons and stuff. Meredith tried to do that. It took like 3 years for them to finally.
I think it's best to have as many friends in as many species as possible. Cannot possibly do you any harm to do those type of things.
Let's call this episode 1 of Downer, because I feel like I
Okay.
feel unsatisfied in exploring. Maybe I'll have to read his book, and then we can come back to talking about him again, because there's an itch I feel like that hasn't been scratched.
Well, yeah, I can give you that.
Oh, thank you.
I've got that around here somewhere.
I'll add it to my list of very not boring books, we'll say.
Well, it's not necessarily well written.
Sure.
I mean, even though the fact that it has been significantly edited,
Yeah.
and that's one of the questions about Carnivals of Life and Death, in that it went through a number of hands.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't have any doubt that that's James Shelby Downard's voice in the book. I'm not necessarily sure to what degree that the other people, whoever those may be, and more importantly than that, probably Adam Parfrey might have, in the editing, and also then he hired someone else to do the editing of it, Alana Freeland.
Oh,
I think.
yeah.
So there are a number of people who had input into that. So you're not getting the pure stuff, which honestly is probably just as well, because the pure stuff is very rough.
Right.
And this probably, so what you've got here is probably something that makes much more sense than the original did. And even then, it's to the point that I found it a very frustrating book. And as I've mentioned, and it's quite true, I really did throw it. I would read it and just get to this point and thinking, this is just, I mean, how can you possibly expect anyone to believe this codswallop? I mean, why can't you come up with this is my continual complaints about, like UFO content. Can't you come up with a better story?
Right.
Just work on it. Just go back, come up with a better story. This isn't really believable, but I would always come back to it, because you'd have to, it's like Perils of Pauline. That's pretty much, it's just this kid who's in constant jeopardy and never seems to catch on as to why he's in jeopardy. And some of them are, I mean, some of it's funny just because it's comical in that way. But the other thing is that this apparently was this guy's reality. So I don't know what to make of that.
Well, yeah, that's that and other questions I think I would like to explore, and there's probably no real connection here, just me putting 2 and 2 together. But I have a book called Marx, Jefferson, and Jesus, Agrarian Socialism in Oklahoma, 1905 to 1915. And so how is that involved in this? Probably not, but it just made me think more. You said Oklahoma politics, so maybe something was going on.
Well, the guy, I don't remember, the first governor who in 23 was impeached, was he was considered to be too pro-labor.
Okay.
All right. And that was, and also there were the Tulsa race riots in 21.
Yeah.
And he called out the National Guard and declared martial law. And that really apparently just pissed off all the Freemasons and Ku Kluxers in the state.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's what got him out.
Interesting.
So
That would, okay. Okay. Well,
all right, we'll do it again.